He didn't come to sell anything. He didn't ask for help. The old man stepped into the pawn shop like a whisper, quiet, unnoticed at first. In his hand, he held a small, worn-out wooden box, the kind that felt heavier than it looked. He set it gently on the glass counter and opened the lid without a word. Inside was a tarnished silver medal. Scratched from time, edges dulled, and its ribbon faded to almost gray. A name was etched on the back, one no one in that shop recognized. The young guy behind the counter barely glanced up. "Whatever that is. Probably fake," he muttered. A voice from the back laughed. "What is that, your granddad's prize from a cereal box?" The old man didn't flinch, didn't get angry. He simply said, "I just wanted to know if it still meant anything." They laughed again, laughed at the medal, at the man. But then the bell above the door jingled, and the air shifted. The man hadn't entered like some storybook veteran. He didn't limp or puff his chest. He walked like someone who'd spent years entering places where he wasn't exactly welcome. The pawn shop was dim. Only one flickering light buzzed above the counter, casting shaky shadows on piles of dust-covered tools and electronics long forgotten. The room smelled like rust and old regret. Behind the counter, the kid, probably in his early 20s, chewed gum and scrolled through his phone. His hoodie was half-zipped and his earbuds dangled from his neck. You could tell by his expression he was already bored and didn't want this shift to last a minute longer. The old man stood for a moment near the entrance, hand resting on the flap of his coat. His gaze drifted around the room, not really seeing, yet more like remembering somewhere else. Then, with soft, quiet steps, he walked up to the counter. His boots barely made a sound against the tile. He reached into the inside of his coat and pulled out the wooden box, setting it gently on the glass. The box had clearly traveled far, scuffed at the corners, but the hinges still smooth. It had been cared for, treasured. The clerk didn't look up at first. He kept scrolling, then said flatly, "Selling something?" The man didn't answer. The kid, annoyed, finally looked. His eyes narrowed slightly, trying to process what he was seeing. Inside the box lay a silver star medal. The ribbon was frayed and the medal was scratched, but it still caught the light. The name on the back was engraved clearly. J.T. Riker, 1973. "Is this real?" the clerk asked, squinting. "Looks old. Where'd you get it?" The man's voice was low. "It was given to me." "For what?" The kid chuckled. Not cruel, just careless. "Winning a game of hopscotch in boot camp?" The old man slowly raised his eyes. "For dragging two soldiers out of a burning barracks. One of them didn't make it." The smirk slipped from the kid's face. He cleared his throat, shifted behind the counter. Yeah. We don't really buy that kind of stuff. Maybe someone online would want it. Collectors and all." The old man didn't look offended. He didn't argue. He just stood there in silence. The hum of the overhead light now seemed unbearably loud. "I'm not here to sell it," he finally said. "Then, why bring it in?" the clerk asked. "To see if anyone still remembers what it meant," the old man replied. The kid didn't answer. He looked at the medal, then away. "It's just a piece of metal, man," he finally said with a shrug. And that's when something shifted, not in the room, but in the weight of it. Because sometimes, the heaviest things in the world are the quietest, the things that sit still, waiting to see if anyone notices them before they're forgotten. The man reached forward, slowly closed the box with both hands, and stood tall. He didn't turn to leave. Not yet. The bell above the door rang again, but this time the sound cut through the room like a blade. A sharp laugh burst from the back. Too loud, too on purpose. It came from a guy in a beat-up leather jacket, leaning on a chipped guitar case. His mirrored sunglasses looked cheap and his smirk even cheaper. "Trying to pawn that thing, old man?" he scoffed. "What's next? Selling your Purple Heart to pay for coffee?" A younger voice joined in, snickering from behind a shelf stacked with dusty gaming consoles. "Bet he found it on Craigslist." The clerk chuckled, trying to look relaxed. "Told you, man, everyone's a war hero when rent's due." The old man didn't react, not outwardly, but something inside him shifted. You could see it in the stillness of his posture. in the way he cradled the box. He'd heard laughter like this before. Once in a bar outside Kandahar, when someone called his unit action movie wannabes. Another time, at a funeral, when a teenager giggled during the eulogy. And worst of all, when someone joked during Caleb's burial. No one said anything back then either. But now, in this dusty pawn shop surrounded by cracked tile and cracked jokes, he almost walked out. Almost. His hand was on the box. He could have left, could have put it back in his drawer at home and told himself that the world just doesn't get it anymore. But he didn't, because walking away would have been easier, and he'd never chosen easy before. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. He stayed. He stood still, box in hand, pride intact. Not out of stubbornness, but because silence deserves defenders too. The bell jingled again, but this time the laughter stopped. The bell above the door didn't sound any different, but the room felt it, like gravity had quietly changed. He didn't announce himself, didn't make a scene. The man who entered didn't have to. His presence spoke first. His boots were scuffed but polished, his dark navy shirt crisp. Just above his chest, a gold trident gleamed, small, unassuming, but unmistakable. No rank, no name tag, just a quiet signal of who he was and what he'd earned. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He walked straight to the counter, passed by the guy with the guitar, ignored the teenager by the consoles, never even glanced at the clerk. His eyes went straight to the box. The old man was still holding it. The Navy SEAL, because that's exactly what he was, stopped just in front of him. For a second, the world seemed to slow. He didn't reach for the box right away. Instead, he looked at it like it was sacred, like it deserved a moment of reverence before being touched. Then, with both hands, he picked up the metal, turned it gently in his fingers, read the name on the back. He didn't say it out loud. Didn't need to. Then he stood up straight. His movements were simple, deliberate. He brought his hand up in a salute, firm, crisp, full of meaning. It wasn't for the room. It wasn't for the crowd. It was for the man in front of him, and for the ones who never came back. It was a salute meant for names carved into stone, for brothers whispered in dreams, for firefights that didn't leave all of them standing. He lowered his hand slowly. Quiet returned, but not the same quiet as before. This one had weight. He turned toward the clerk now, finally addressing someone other than the old man. His voice was calm, but it didn't need volume to carry. "This metal isn't just metal," he said. "It's not about what it's worth in your system. It's about what it cost the man who earned it, and what it saved when it was pinned." To his chest, he paused, then continued. "I was there, not the same war, different sand, different years. But I know that silence. I know what it means when the noise stops and only your breath is left to prove you're alive." The clerk opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to make a joke. But no words came. He swallowed, lowered his eyes, and stayed silent. The man in the leather jacket suddenly didn't look so confident. He adjusted his grip on the guitar, pretended to check a string, but his hands were stiff. Embarrassed, no one else spoke. The SEAL turned back to the old man and handed him the medal with both hands. Not like a gift, not like something returned. Like a gesture, a sign of shared burden, one warrior to another. Then he looked around the shop once, not to intimidate, not to threaten, just to remind them of something they'd forgotten. "You don't get to mock what you never had the courage to earn," he said. Then he nodded once to the old man, and without waiting for permission, turned and walked out. The bell jingled as the door shut behind him, but now even that sound felt changed. Like the room itself understood it wasn't time for noise. No one moved. Not right away. The old man stood, medal in hand, his eyes not focused on anything in particular. Not angry, not proud, just steady. The guy with the guitar finally set it, down. Carefully this time, as if even the wood deserved more respect now. The clerk, quiet as ever, cleared his throat and glanced up. "Sir," he started, but then stopped himself. There was nothing else to say. The old man didn't respond, didn't need to. He simply closed the box, gently, like someone closing a book that meant more than words could hold. He tucked it back under his arm. Then slowly, not because he was weak, but because the moment demanded it, he turned and headed for the door. No one picked up their phone. No one laughed. No one even moved until the door clicked shut behind him. Out on the sidewalk, the sun had dipped just enough to stretch shadows across the street. The old man walked at the same quiet pace he'd come in with. He didn't glance back. He didn't need to know what was happening inside. Inside, something had shifted. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was realization. The pawnshop clerk looked down at the counter where the box had been. He reached for the receipt roll, then stopped. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, from thought. In the back, the teenager with the console stood up. Not to leave, just to stand. Because sometimes when silence teaches you something, sitting feels disrespectful. And the man in the leather jacket? He sat back down. Guitar still on his lap, sunglasses off now. And for the first time, his smirk was gone. The old man didn't go home. Not yet. He walked 3 blocks, turned down a quiet path behind the town's elementary school, and stopped at a weather-worn bench under an old oak tree. He sat down slowly and placed the metal box beside him. It wasn't a place of honor. It wasn't a memorial. But it was where he always came, same date, every year. He sat still. A breeze stirred leaves overhead. Then he whispered one word. Just one Caleb. He didn't say anything else, didn't need to. Because in some lives, one name carries everything. The bench wasn't marked. There was no plaque, no flowers. Just the same cracked wood slats and faded green paint peeling at the edges. But for him, it wasn't about the bench. It was about the silence it held. The space it gave him each year to carry a memory too heavy. For ordinary days, the silver star stayed beside him unopened. He didn't need to see it. He remembered every scratch, every curve, every letter etched into the back. He'd held it the night they gave it to him, in a quiet hallway after a ceremony he hadn't invited anyone to. Just him and a folded flag. No cameras. No parade. He never wore it in public. Never told the story at barbecues. Never corrected anyone who assumed he'd never seen action. The truth was, he hadn't needed a medal to know what he'd lived through. And he never wanted to turn something sacred into something showy. That day had stayed with him. The one that earned the medal. He'd been 24, 2 weeks from coming home. The mission had come down late at night. Bad intel, rushed orders, no support. They were told the hill was clear. It wasn't. The first burst of fire caught Johnson in the shoulder. Then Simmons took one in the side. They scrambled for cover behind a stone ridge, but it wasn't enough. Radio silence, no backup. Just the sound of gunfire echoing in his chest. He could have waited, could have stayed down and hoped someone would make it through. But that wasn't who he was. It wasn't who they were. He ran into the open, not because it was brave, but because it was necessary. Dragged Johnson first, one arm slung over his shoulder, blood dripping fast, then crawled back through the dirt for Simmons. The kid was barely conscious, whispering something over and over. His mother's name. The bullets came close. One snapped through his sleeve. Another clipped his boot. But he didn't stop. Not until both men were behind the ridge. By the time medics arrived, he was still kneeling there, Simmons's hand gripped in his own. They tried to pull him away, but he wouldn't let go until he felt Simmons breathe his last. 3 weeks later, they pinned the medal to his chest. He kept it in that box ever since. Not on a shelf, not on display. In the inner pocket of his coat, right over his heart. Only came out once a year. On the same day. To sit on the same bench. To whisper the same name. Caleb. Not everyone knew who that was. Most people never asked. They just thought he was a quiet man. Maybe a little distant. Maybe a little odd. But no one ever asked what he carried. Because no one really wants to know how a name can feel heavier than a weapon. This year, though, something was different. He noticed it before he heard it. A presence. Someone else at the far end of the park path. A kid, probably high school age, hanging back near the trees. Backpack slung too low, sneakers loose. A camera hanging around his neck. Just standing there, like he wasn't sure if he should come closer. The old man figured he'd walk on like the others. Maybe glance over at the bench, take a picture of the sunrise and the fog drifting across the grass and move along. But he didn't. The kid walked closer, slowly, respectfully, not with swagger, just presence. And when he reached the bench, he didn't speak. He sat on the other end, legs swinging slightly, camera still resting on his chest. He didn't take a photo, didn't ask anything, just sat in the silence with him. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the boy looked up at the sky and said, "My brother was supposed to come home last spring." The old man didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because he knew exactly what that sentence meant. Some things don't need explanations. They just need room to exist. The kid reached into his backpack and pulled out a journal, leather-bound, worn, personal, not the kind you use for school notes. He flipped through the pages slowly, then stopped and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was part of a letter. He handed it to the old man. The man unfolded it carefully. The edges were frayed. The ink slightly faded. It read, "Keep doing what matters even if no one claps." He read it twice. Then folded it again and slid it into the pocket behind the metal, a space he usually left for names he never said out loud. The old man looked at the boy, really looked at him. "Do you say his name?" he asked gently. "Yeah," the boy said. "Every day." They didn't speak after that, didn't need to, because sometimes grief doesn't want words. It just wants company. They sat in silence, and in that moment, for the first time in years, the weight the old man carried didn't feel quite so lonely. The photo wasn't planned. The boy hadn't come looking to capture a moment. But something about the way the light landed that morning, the way it touched the wrinkles in the old man's hands, the faded flag resting on his lap, the silence between them. It just felt like it mattered. He took the picture quietly. One frame, no flash, no words, just the truth. That night he posted it online. No hashtags, no caption, just a single word. Still. By morning, the image had been shared more than he expected. Dozens, then hundreds, then more. But it wasn't the usual noise of internet buzz. People didn't reply with fire emojis or clapping gifs. They replied with names, dates, bits of letters never sent, photos of medals tucked away in attic boxes, stories that had never been told. And just like that, something changed in town. The same town that had walked past the old man for over a decade, barely noticing him on that bench, suddenly slowed down. Suddenly saw him. The first person to show up the next day was the town librarian. She didn't say anything, just brought a small wooden stool and sat beside the bench with a book in one hand and a flickering tea candle in the other. Then came the mailman, still in uniform. He placed a sealed envelope on the bench. On the front, in shaky pencil, he had written, "Thank you." After that came the coffee guy. Then the pastor. Then a teenager the old man vaguely recognized, the one who used to skip school, always practicing beatboxing outside the gas station. He showed up, stood quietly, both hands in his hoodie pocket, and stared at the folded flag like he had just realized it wasn't a movie prop. It was real. It had meaning. And so did the man who carried it. By noon, the space around the bench was full. Not loud, not chaotic, just full. Some people stood, some knelt, a few cried, but no one pulled out a phone. They weren't there for a post. They were there for a presence. Then the mayor arrived, not with a speech, not with cameras. She wore her father's old dog tag around her neck and walked quietly behind the bench. In her hand, she held a small plaque. She didn't interrupt. She simply pressed the plaque into the earth behind the bench and whispered, "This spot matters." She didn't stay long. She didn't need to, because sometimes Respect doesn't require more than presence. The old man didn't speak, but his hand stopped trembling. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the silence alone, and that's all remembrance ever really asks for. Not attention, not applause, just someone else willing to hold part of the weight. That winter, he didn't return to the bench. There was no announcement, no funeral, no newspaper obituary. He passed the same way he lived, quietly, with no spotlight, no fuss. At home, there was a coat still hanging by the door. A folded letter left on the table, the metal tucked away where it had always been. But he hadn't left nothing behind. The boy came back, on the same morning, November 6th. Just like always, this time the boy was the one carrying the flag, not boxed, not hidden. Cradled gently in both arms like it held a life too precious to speak of casually. He placed it on the bench, sat beside it, and waited. People came, one by one. Not because a post went viral, not because it was trending. They came because some things are worth showing up for. The barista brought 2 coffees this time. One black, one with cream. The mayor showed up early. No badge. Just the same dog tag and her silence. Even the pawn shop clerk came. He stood at the back, hands in his pockets, no smirk, no words, just presence. And when the sun was high, the boy stood up. He picked up the flag and unfolded it, once, twice, 3 times, until it lay wide and visible across his arms. Then, with steady fingers, he folded it back again. Slow, precise, the way he had been taught. Sharp corners, clean lines. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But when he placed the final fold over his heart, everyone around him raised a hand, not to wave, not to record, but to salute. Not just the flag, not just the man, but the promise that he wouldn't be the last remembered this way. Because 1 fold can mean loss, but 10 folds mean legacy. The bench had never meant to be a memorial. It wasn't carved from marble. There were no engraved names or wreaths. But now everyone in town understood. It didn't need to be made of stone to carry weight. It just needed someone who had carried enough for everyone else, quietly, for years. Each November after that, people came back. Not because they were told to, but because something inside them told them it mattered. One year, a young mother brought her daughter. The girl couldn't have been more than 5. She carried a small bouquet of plastic daisies and asked if she could leave them for the soldier who made people nicer. The mother nodded, eyes wet, and helped her tuck the flowers gently beneath the bench. Another year, an older man in a faded baseball cap came and just sat. Didn't talk to anyone. Didn't look around. Just stared ahead like he saw something. The rest couldn't. When he finally stood to leave, he left behind a patch from his jacket. No words, no name, just a symbol, a gesture. Even the kid with the beat-up guitar from the pawn shop showed up once. He didn't speak, didn't bring his guitar, just stood there with his hands folded, head bowed, and left a note that read, "I get it now." The boy who had first taken the photo came every year, never missing one. He grew older, his shoes got bigger, his camera changed, but the ritual remained the same. Arrive early, carry the flag, sit for a while, say the name, fold the flag again, walk home quietly. One year, when he was 22, he brought his younger cousin with him, a girl who didn't quite understand why people were gathering around an old bench in a cold park. But she stood next to him anyway, listened, watched, and before they left, she whispered, "I think I'll come back next year too." That was the whole point. It had never been about building a monument. It had always been about building memory. Years later, long after most of the original faces stopped coming, someone placed a small sign on the bench. Just a piece of wood with white painted letters that read, "He never asked to be remembered, but we chose to anyway." The bench became part of the town without needing to be announced. Teachers would bring their students during Veterans Week and explain that not all heroes needed to be loud. Coaches would point at the bench when players complained about running one more lap. "You want to talk about tough?" they'd say. Even the new clerk at the pawn shop, who had no idea what had happened years ago, learned to pause whenever an older man came in with something in a wooden box. He didn't always understand, but he understood enough to stop and listen, and that made all the difference. The boy, now a man, still came. Even when he had a job, even when he had his own family, every November, same coat, same flag, same bench. Some years, it rained. Some years, it snowed. One year it was 82 degrees and sunny, but the weather never mattered, because memory doesn't check forecasts. One morning, while sitting on the bench alone again, he reached into the pocket behind the folded flag. Inside was a small, worn scrap of paper. Faded, soft at the edges, still legible. Keep doing what matters, even if no one claps. He smiled, folded it back in place, placed his hand over the flag and whispered, "Still matters." That year, something small happened. A boy, maybe 10 or 11, approached him slowly. Alone. Backpack slung low. Nervous. Sir?" the kid asked. He turned gently. "Yeah? Was this for a soldier?" "It was," he nodded. "A very good one." The kid looked down, then held something out. A drawing, crayon on paper, a stick figure with a flag in one hand and stars all around. "I made this for school. I didn't know where to put it," he said. The man took it carefully, studied it. "I know the perfect place," he said. He tucked the drawing into the wooden box, right next to the medal. And in that moment, he realized something. Legacy doesn't always show up loud. Sometimes it shows up in quiet hands, in awkward questions, in drawings made with too much yellow. That night when he walked home, he didn't feel heavy. He didn't feel alone. He felt full, because the silence he'd inherited, the one so many had ignored, was now shared, held, honored, passed on, not with speeches but with footsteps, with presence. And every year that flag, creased and faded, as it was carried one more time, folded, unfolded, folded again. Not because someone told them to, but because remembrance, when real, doesn't need to be told. It just needs to be witnessed. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.